God creates man. Man destroys God. Man creates dinosaurs.
If you were to meet Dr. Robert Baker, he would probably change your understanding of how science and faith interact. Or he would at least strike your curiosity. Because Baker isn't your typical Pentecostal pastor. Rather than being into snakes, he's into dinosaurs, and just so happens to be one of America's leading paleontologists with a PhD from Harvard and countless fossil discoveries to his name. His work has shown if you approach the question of dinosaurs in the Bible as a simple yes or no answer, you might be missing the point entirely. The real question isn't whether dinosaurs are explicitly mentioned in the Bible. It's about understanding how ancient texts describe the natural world and what that means for our modern interpretation of both science and scripture. This is a story of how we read ancient texts, about the surprising ways different cultures describe the same phenomenon, and how our modern preconceptions often blind us to the obvious. But more importantly, it's about what happens when we stop asking the wrong questions and start asking the right ones. Consider for a moment how you would describe a rhinoceros to someone who had never seen one, using only vocabulary available to, well, people who lived 3,000 years ago. Now, for you and I, this is a hypothetical exercise, but it's exactly the challenge faced by ancient writers who are trying to describe the natural world around them. And so when we translate ancient texts, we're not just converting words from one language to another. We're attempting to bridge worldviews and entire systems of categorization and understanding reality. Which brings us to the first insight. The Bible wasn't written with modern scientific taxonomy, which is just the science of classification and categorization. It didn't have that in mind. Its authors used the language and categories available to them, which often meant describing things in terms of what they resemble rather than what they technically were. Take the Hebrew word tanin, which it appears multiple times in the Old Testament, and it's translated as dragon, serpent, or even sea monster. And modern biblical scholars have noted that the word, it seems to describe any large, fearsome creature, particularly those associated with water. However, could some of these references be describing what we now know as dinosaur fossils? In the book of Job, chapter 40, we encounter a fascinating description of a creature called Behemoth. And the passage reads, "Look at Behemoth, which I made along with you, and which feeds on grass like an ox, what strength it has in its loins, what power in the muscle of its belly, its tail sways like a cedar, the sinew of its thighs are close knit. Its bones are tubes of bronze, its limbs like rods of iron." And some biblical scholars, dating back to the 17th century, have seen this as maybe a poetic description of a hippopotamus or an elephant. The problem with this interpretation, as the Armstrong Institute of Biblical Archaeology notes, the key is the tail. The text tells us the tail is like a cedar tree. Hippos and elephants have relatively tiny tails, but you know what had a tail like a cedar tree? Sauropod dinosaurs, like the Diplodocus. Or, as the Armstrong Institute notes, and I'm not even going to try and pronounce it, but it's right here, which was essentially a gigantic hornless rhino. And I mean gigantic. And this observation leads us to an interesting possibility. What if the ancient authors of Job were describing something they had actually seen, like or perhaps what they saw was not a living dinosaur, but rather a fossil? See, the Middle East is rich with dinosaur fossils, and ancient people would have encountered these bones, and they would have needed some way to make sense of them. And here's where our story takes an unexpected turn. In the 1990s, Dr. Adriana Mayer made a groundbreaking discovery. She found that many ancient Greek and Roman myths about giants and monsters corresponded remarkably well with locations where dinosaur fossils are abundant. You can check it out in her book here. But this pattern isn't unique to Greco-Roman culture. Throughout the Middle East, fossil beds have been discovered near ancient settlement sites. And these areas often correspond with local legends about giants, dragons, or massive beasts. And many biblical references to great beasts, they align with areas we now know are rich in dinosaur fossils. Now, it's not proof that the biblical authors were necessarily describing dinosaurs, but it does suggest they were aware of and trying to make sense of these remarkable bones that they too found in the earth. And perhaps the most intriguing biblical reference comes in the form of the Leviathan described in Job 41. The text speaks of a fearsome creature with terrible teeth, breathing fire and smoke, with scales so tight no air could pass between them. And here is an interesting possibility. When we find a theropod dinosaur fossil, particularly something like Tyrannosaurus rex, we're looking at creatures that match that description. Powerful jaws, robust scales. If you were an ancient person and you discovered these fossils, how would you describe them? Now, for you and I, the fire-breathing aspect might seem like a stretch to us, but it might be an ancient person's attempt to make sense of something they couldn't quite understand. If you found a skull and had massive teeth and what appeared to be armored plates thousands of years ago, isn't it possible to assume maybe the creature was capable of more? This brings us to the memory pattern, the way human societies record and transmit information about the natural world across generations. And it's a pattern we see repeated throughout history. When people encounter something they can't fully explain, they will create narratives that blend observation with imagination. So different cultures incorporate fossil discoveries into their own worldview. And what you find is how consistent the pattern is. Whether you're looking at Native American legends about thunderbirds, Chinese dragon myths, or biblical accounts of great beasts, you find these descriptions are often rooted in actual encounters with fossil remains. And this pattern suggests something about how we should read ancient texts. Rather than asking whether dinosaurs are explicitly mentioned in the Bible, we should be asking how ancient people incorporated their real-world observations into their understanding of creation. Dr. Baker, our paleontologist, Pentecostal from the beginning of the story, he offers a perspective in his work, I think, that brings together all these threads. He shows us that the Bible isn't a scientific textbook. It's a book about God's relationship with his creation. And when it describes great beasts and fearsome creatures, it's doing so really to make a point about God's power, but also his creativity. Biblical authors, they were writing about real things they observed in the world around them. And so they used the language and the concepts available to them. And whether they were describing living animals, fossil remains, or some combination of both, they were attempting to make sense of God's creation in the context of their time and place. And what we've discovered is something far more interesting than a simple yes or no answer about dinosaurs in the Bible. We've uncovered a pattern of human observation, interpretation, and meaning-making that spans cultures and centuries. The real message isn't about whether dinosaurs are mentioned in the Bible. It's about understanding that both science and Scripture are ways of engaging with God's creation. They're different languages, telling complementary stories. And perhaps that's the most important lesson of all, that when we stop trying to force ancient texts to answer modern questions and instead try to understand them on their own terms, we often discover something far more valuable, a window into how human beings have always struggled to understand their place in a vast and mysterious universe.
Life will find a way.